The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Can folks hear me? Okay. Real quick. Tiffany, I just unmuted you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Nice. All right. So we're gonna get started right now. Thank y'all for being here on time for our Civic Engagement 101 training. Um, Again, this is just us getting engaged with the Civic Engagement Plan for the Youth and College Division. Is there a reverb happening? Yeah, so this is our civic engagement plan for this year. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pass it to Tiffany to say a few greetings about civic engagement, the importance of us engaging in the civic engagement process for this year.
Thank you so much, Wisdom. Good evening, everyone. I hope that you all are doing well, enjoying your summer. Of course, we are, I keep saying six days away from convention because the youth and college portion starts, of course, on the Sunday. But we are technically 4 days away from convention, and I'm looking forward to seeing those of you who are going to be in attendance. This is a precursor to convention and opening. At convention, of course, our theme, Defeat, Hate, Vote, vote is centered around how we need to activate and engage new members, current members, and potential members for the future around our democracy in this country, specifically even tonight, while 45 is going to introduce his nominees for the Supreme Court, all the things that we've seen this past week, and all the things that we've seen this past summer even. Now more than ever, it is more important for us to understand our power and our voting power and our electoral power. I'm really excited about this call because this is the first time Jamal will be giving a training to the Youth and College Division National Youth Work Committee. And you all, of course, are our national leaders, volunteer stakeholders, and the folks who organize and move the people on the ground. And so starting with you all to have this conversation and understand this information is essential to us having a successful program as an association, but more importantly, for us to be able to have some real concrete victories that improve people's lives. So I'm very excited about tonight's training. I hope that you all asked really challenging questions to understand the information deeply, and that you use Jamal, myself, and Wisdom as a resource That's all I have to say. Wisdom, thank you for pulling this call together. And Jamal, thank you for the information that you're going to share with folks. We appreciate y'all. And I think that my boss, President Johnson, should be on the line as well, Wisdom.
Hey, Tiffany, this is Jamal. I'm still here. Wisdom, you may be muted.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm looking for President Johnson. I'm not seeing it come up on the list of attendees.
Well, then, if you all don't mind, what we can do is get started. And when he arrives, just let me know, and I'll press pause so that he can jump in and share some words of wisdom, if you will. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
All right, wonderful. So good evening, everyone. My name is Jamal Watkins, and I proudly serve as the lead on the staff for the civic engagement work that we are doing inside of the NAACP. But more importantly, I am an alum, if you will, of the Youth and College Division. I actually joined the NAACP when I was at the ripe old age of 8. And our first activity in California, where I grew up, we were knocking on doors as a youth council in Bakersfield, California, and we would ask all the grown folks, are they registered to vote? And the law says, actually, as a person under the age of 18, that we couldn't register them to vote, but people would open the door for kids. They thought we were cute and were like, oh, okay, this is no problem. You're selling candy. We were like, no, we want to know if you're registered to vote. And when they would say yes, we'd be like, great, we want you to vote. We'd hand them some information. When they'd say no, we'd have a grown person run up from, who's standing back behind us to get them registered to vote. And so when I think about my experience in the NAACP, it started with civic engagement and it started with the Youth and College Division. So I'm honored to be able to do this webinar tonight with you all. Now, I'm going to go through some things that, I've heard folks say in this moment, and you all should be able to see my screen, that, we've heard a lot of this information and we know what's going on. And some of you have probably done this work in your own communities, whether it's voter registration, et cetera. What I really want to do is go through a couple of key terms to unpack as we think about our civic engagement program for this year. So many of you have probably heard that we are on a 5-year strategy course, if you will, around building independent political power in our communities. And of course, that sounds very technical and kind of corny, but what it really means is that we have critical elections that we have to win in order to make sure that the things we care about are passed in terms of laws, and that our issues and that our agenda is the agenda that's leading. Right now, the folks in power who don't really look like us or think like us are doing their own thing. And as you just heard from many of us, we're worried about the fact that even on the Supreme Court, appointing someone like Brett Kavanaugh before the end of this election is problematic and premature, because at the end of the day, we know that many Americans, and especially communities of color in the Black community, are going to vote some folks out and vote some folks in who really are going to reflect our agenda. And so we want to make sure that things like the Supreme Court are not used as a tool against us until after this election cycle is over. But what I want to do on this call is not to go into the traditional space of talking about the infrequent voters we're going to actually mobilize, because that's important, or the new voters we're going to register. I want to talk about some terms that folks have been hearing and wrestling with, but that we want to clarify for the case of the NAACP and specifically for the Youth and College Division. So I'm going to start with civic engagement. Now, for those of you who are in school, which hopefully it's most of you or all of you, I took an excerpt from a document around civic responsibility. When you hear the term civic engagement, it sounds very big. It's a broad term, but it really is about us as Black folks, us as a community, really owning the political and non-political process that affects our communities. For example, I've heard folks talk about things like potholes or street lights or, where you have bus stops and banks in your community. all of those things are literally connected to civic engagement. They're affected by the laws that are passed, or they're affected by politicians who get elected to implement the law, or they're affected by folks who work for government. And so when we think about this notion of civic engagement, it's literally how do we lean in terms of making sure that the world around us and the community that we live in actually benefits us and our neighbors and our families writ large. And so civic engagement is a broad term, if you will, but for the NAACP, in an NAACP context, it really falls into three unique categories. And this is important because when folks say, well, what do you mean by civic engagement? What we're ultimately talking about is voter registration, voter education, and voter mobilization. And of course, we all know what these terms mean at a big level. And so on this slide, we wanted to really unpack, like, what are the things that show up under voter registration that many of us are used to doing? So the first is direct voter contact. We are an organization of people who talk to people. And so if we're going to register folks to vote, it means that we're reaching out to human beings and we're talking to them, we're engaging them, getting them ready to actually participate as a new voter by registering to vote. And you see direct voter contact falls under the other categories as well. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit more, but it's the notion that our power in terms of civic engagement is being able to talk to human beings and to move them in a community that actually affects the outcomes of elections and legislation. But we also do information dissemination across the board. We're educating folks in the sense of sharing information. Like this whole Supreme Court crisis that we're in right now, we're going to be having some calls this week. We're going to be working with you all to make sure that we're calling the senators and having them to really delay this whole appointment process. But we have to get out the information to our communities, and that's something that we would do in a civic engagement context because it's about owning our political destiny. But we also do data collection. When we think about the van and hear about the van, it literally is a data repository. It's where we collect information. The van is really amazing in that we can know a person's name, address, email address, phone number, cell phone number, how many times they voted. And you can also bring in other points of data like, are these individuals likely Black, likely Asian, likely Latinx? And so data collection is a big part of our civic engagement program, if you will, across the board. But we also do things like trainings, what we're doing right now, webinars, in-person, political boot camps, a lot of trainings. And we also do a lot of persuasion work. We're trying to convince folks that it's important for them to take ownership within their communities. I'm preaching to the choir here because many of you understand how important it is for us to really lean in and own our political destiny. But, sometimes our neighbors, heck, even our families and friends may not fully get it. And so we're really trying to persuade them to register to vote if they're not registered, to understand through voter education what their rights are, but what's really at stake, and then to mobilize them through GOTV efforts to get them to vote and to actually exercise their power. And at the end of the day, all of our work has to be rooted in, I believe, three things: asking folks to act, asking folks to join us, and asking folks to give of their time, their talent, and their treasure, or their money, if you will. And so when we think about this, the civic engagement program at the NAACP are rooted in these three buckets. And we want folks to have this information so that it doesn't sound theoretical or like, what the heck does that mean? It means we're doing voter registration, voter education, and voter mobilization, or what other folks would normally say is like GOTV. But, it's important to list these three as really, this is what we mean at the NAACP in terms of civic engagement. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard the term partisan versus nonpartisan. As an organization, we don't belong to any other organization. And in this context, that means political parties. We don't belong to the Republicans, the Democrats, the Libertarians, the Green Party, etc. And so when we think about our work is rooted in two very clear goals. One is to end racial discrimination, and one is to close any gaps as it relates to outcomes, if you will, in terms of things that we label as game changers, like healthcare. Healthcare should be actually something that benefits us all. And if something's going wrong in the Black community, but it's not going wrong in the general population or in the white community, then we got to close those gaps. So when we think about our agenda, it's really rooted in a nonpartisan way, meaning it's not based on a particular political group. but it's based upon the needs of our community, communities of color, the Black community, in terms of eradicating discrimination and really promoting equality and equality of outcomes at the end of the day. Now, this feels maybe like a corny civic lesson, but we threw in a slide here that lifts up the fact that in the US, you're talking about the two major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, but then you have some third parties, the Green Party, the Constitution Party, the Libertarian Party, and then depending on the state you live in, you may have some state-based parties, like the Working Families Party is, I believe, in at least 9 states, but they're not national as of yet. And so none of these parties actually own the NAACP and will never own us. We actually look at the parties as other organizations who have to do what's best for our communities and for the communities that we live in and we serve. And so from that standpoint, we rarely will find ourselves in any type of partisan fight. But the reality is sometimes there's one party or two parties that actually are more beneficial to our agenda than the others. But at the end of the day, whether you're a Republican or a Green Party member, if you don't have the best interests of the Black community and communities of color in mind, and you're not willing to fight discrimination and to close those gaps, then we're not going to vote for you. And we're not going to vote for your agenda. And so that's what it really means when we talk about this notion of partisan versus nonpartisan. I'm going to stop there before I jump into organizational tax status wisdom. I know you're moderating, and see if folks have any questions so far about, sort of the big picture around what is civic engagement for the NAACP and what does it mean for us to do nonpartisan work.
All right, so I see that, Erica, you have your hand up. I'm going to unmute you right now. If you have a question, could you please speak? Go ahead, Erica.
I'm sorry, Wisdom. I just was saying hi. I don't have my hand. I don't have a question. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Well, it's good to hear your voice. So if any time you all want, you can put your hand up or even type a message to Wisdom so that, I can stop and answer questions, and I'll pause periodically. I'm going to keep going because the biggest thing that we hear about all the time is tax status. Everyone talks about being a 501c3, a 501c4. And if you take a step back, here in the United States, every business or entity that we deal with has a tax status. If you go to a school or a university, they have a certain tax status. If your parents or you have a job and you work for a company or a corporation, they have a tax status. The NAACP is no different than any other organization that we fall under the purview of the United States government in terms of tax. But we fall under the 29 types of nonprofit organizations that are exempt from some federal income tax. So we are known as nonprofits or not-for-profit organizations. But there's 29 of them. If you look at the slide I'm showing, I listed out all 29 because they cover a range of different organizations and entities that we may or may not be familiar with. For example, there is 501c23 are veterans organizations. They have their own special tax status. So if you were a veteran and you join a veteran-specific organization like Boat Vets, for example, they actually leverage a 501c23 tax status, which is different than the others. But what is most important for us to know from this call is that the NAACP operates really with probably in the lane of 3 different tax statuses. 501c3s, which is, a tax status that allows for folks to give us money and they actually can write it off on their taxes. And it allows for us to do, educational work, advocacy work around issues and to promote public safety and to do things that are beneficial to society. But it's all in this non-for-profit space and it's not about the political parties. But we also have a thing called the 501c3, which allows for us to do more social welfare advocacy work. It allows for us to kind of beat up on individuals who are bad actors, bad politicians, and even bad political parties at times. So if the Democrats are messing it up when it comes to healthcare, we can use our C4 to say the Democrats are messing it up when it comes to healthcare, and here's why. Under the C3 side of things, we can't do it in that sort of hard way of going after them directly. It has to be more about the issue itself. But then we also have friends that work with us through the 501c5 organizations. For the Youth Work Committee, you all are familiar with these folks from labor unions. So the Robin Williams of the world, the George Greshams, they all represent labor unions, and labor unions are 501c5s, and they play with us very heavily. There are other organizations that fall within these other C's, like the 501c6 organizations, like the Chamber of Commerce, and 9 times out of 10, the Chamber of Commerce are the folks who are fighting us. But at the end of the day, when we think about sort of this notion of tax status, we fall under a C3 and a C4 umbrella, and we play a lot with 501c5s. There are also other types of tax-exempt organizations, and I'm highlighting this because there are 527s who we play with a lot, and that includes political parties and super PACs, folks who give us money to do things like voter mobilization and GOTV. And now we are not a 527 as the NAACP, but sometimes we interact and play with 527s because they're all around us and they do political work. And so when we think about the context of civic engagement, we live in this tax status reality. And this is all important because there are certain rules that we follow in order to do the work that's most important. But fundamentally, our goal is, if you go back to that slide that talks about voter registration, voter education, and voter mobilization, that literally is where we live in terms of the work that we're doing. And sometimes we interact with all of these other charitable organizations, 521s, 501c6s, 7s, 8s, in order to get the job done. But we specifically are a C4 entity and a C3 entity at times in order to get the work done. This next slide sort of shows you how it plays out in terms of infrastructure. And the reason why I like this is when I was in the Youth and College Division, you know, my college chapter in California, we were like, what are we? Are we a C3 or a C4? We, by the Constitution and bylaws of the NAACP, all units are 501c4 organizations. Same as the National Voter Fund, which is its own NAACP entity that's designed to do voter mobilization, registration, and protection work. But we also fall under or are connected to what will soon be a national 501c4 housed in the national office, which sits right next to this orange sort of bubble, which is a national 501c3. Now, of course, I know folks are like, why does this matter? Why do we have to talk about this? This is boring. It doesn't make sense. It matters in terms of not only the type of work you can do, but the type of resources that you're able to get. So when you hear about a foundation giving us a grant, 9 times out of 10, that's a 501c3 grant activity. It allows for us to pay for whether it's, you know, food for volunteers who are doing voter registration, or actually to give folks a stipend who are working on campuses doing civic engagement work. It really matters in terms of the types of resources we attract and what we can do with them. And so at times you're going to hear us talk about C3 activities versus C4 activities, but your job won't be to really dissect that. We want to just make sure that we're doing things according to the rule of law, but also what makes most sense for moving our communities. The thing I'll say about this, and then I'll open it up for the floor for questions, is that there are some parts of the country where you got to do a little more convincing of Black folks on the types of issues they should be voting on. And it may be because of the geography or, you know, the type of community it is in terms of economics. And so sometimes you got to do a lot of hard lifting in order to persuade folks that it's important for them to vote. And so you would choose, like, let's do 501c4 work where we really got to do more persuasion. In other places, it may be just as simple as getting folks the information so that they know it's time to vote and where to go vote. And for Black folks, we tend to vote statistically on the progressive side. Black women vote 93 to 95% progressive. Black men are in the lower 90 percentile, if you will. And so in many ways, our community's problem is not about how we vote or who we vote for. It's about actually getting us to vote consistently. And so the C3, C4 work allows for us to figure out where we got to go really hard or where we can just get folks mobilized and motivated without having to do a hard narrative around what's at stake, because we just need to get them to the polls. So I'm going to stop there because I know this stuff sounds sometimes confusing or may not be clear, and open up the floor to see if folks have any questions around C3, C4 tax status.
So we had a question of, does the national office keep record of each unit's tax ID number?
Yes, every single unit is a 501c4, and at the end of the year, we file a joint tax filing with the units. And so it's why being in compliance matters so much. Like what's amazing about the units and about the NAACP is that we have, several thousand, a couple of thousand units. And if you add in youth and college division, it's, well over 2,200 units who are their own 501c4 organizations. And I say that because there are other folks who have a whole lot of money, like the Koch brothers. They wish they had as many folks like us running organizations locally and on campuses and in communities that are able to speak truth to power about, an agenda, if you will. And so, yes, the national office keeps those numbers, but every year we have to file taxes with Uncle Sam so that folks don't go to jail and that we don't, get in hot water for not being compliant with the federal government. Similar to when individuals have to file taxes, we do the same thing as an entire organization with, a couple of thousand units. So it's a lot of work and it's important, but it keeps us on the straight and narrow so that we can do the good work in our communities.
If anybody else had any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I can unmute you, or if you can write down in the question link.
All right, well, I'm going to keep going, but just note, we will try to keep reminding folks about the importance of being in a nonpartisan context, so doing work that's not based on one political party or the other. We'll keep driving the message and narrative around doing voter registration, voter education, and voter mobilization through GOTV. And we'll make sure that folks understand when we're doing stuff in a C3 or C4 context, what that means. And it may be as subtle as a piece of literature, like a piece of, a postcard you get. The language may change a little bit depending on how far we go with the C3 or the C4. But 9 times out of 10, it is going to be deeply rooted in an agenda, meaning laws and policies that better our community. And that's our core focus. And it's not so much about the candidates or the political parties themselves. But I want to talk a little bit about direct voter contact programs. So how do we do this? What actually brings this thing to life? I know that it says here under voter registration, we're going to cover more in depth at July trainings. And I think Tiffany, Wisdom, and Quincy are working on a civic engagement training that may fall in early August. So July was a goal, but I think we'll probably end up landing in early August. But I do want to talk about voter registration and voter mobilization / GOTV. Like, what are the things that bring it to life? So that, for those of you who've done this will be a cakewalk. You'll be like, oh yeah, I get it. I do this. I've done it before. And for those of you who are not fully familiar, hopefully you'll learn a little bit about what it means to do direct voter contact. Earlier, I talked about that being our power. And so one of the things that we do as an organization is we do door canvasses. We literally knock on doors. And when you think about the van system, the van allows for you to figure out which doors to knock on and who lives behind those doors with a great degree of probability that those people actually exist and who they are. And so when we try to register folks who are unregistered, we want to see in the van who's unregistered so we can go knock on their doors. And when it's time to mobilize folks, we look at who's the person that's least likely to vote in a midterm election like in 2018, and we go and knock on their doors and educate them and motivate them and convince them to be a part of the electoral process, to be a part of the civic engagement universe. We also do things like street and event canvases. I know that many of you have done tabling or have actually had a clipboard and had to walk around a street fair or a community festival. Or heck, you've even done it after church. You stand in the vestibule and you make sure you're talking to folks about either registering to vote or reminding them to go vote and to find their polling place. And so a part of it is the doors, but also doing event / street canvassing, if you will, or engagement. And I lifted up tabling as a standalone because it's a pretty common piece of work that we do when we're talking to voters. You set up a table, you have all your materials, and depending on where it is, you get a lot of traffic. And if you do it right, you get a lot of results. But then there's also the newness of social media and the digital world. And so you have email, which is, emailing folks with information is important. leveraging social media, Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, whatever it takes to get the message out, we will use. But then there's also text messaging or SMS. What's surprising is that young Black folks and young people of color, Latinos, API folks, Native Americans, use text messaging and mobile phones more than any other community. And so the greatest way to get to younger voters is really to text message them. Whereas if you're talking about older voters, it's, phone banks work where somebody has a landline and you call them on the phone and talk to them. I know my grandmother refuses sometimes to answer her cell phone, but she'll answer her landline. And so depending on who we're going after, we use things like text messaging to get the folks fired up about the work. And then there's mail. I don't know if any of you still get mail at home or get mail on your campuses or even get mail, but there's a large universe of folks who still look in their mailboxes and read their mail and are motivated by what they get. And so we use mail at times to make sure that folks are educated or reminded to register to vote, thanking them for registering to vote, and driving them to turn out to vote in the right ways. I'm going to stop there and see if folks have any questions around direct voter contact programs, because in a second, we're going to go into how do you start to build out these through a model, if you will. Any questions?
We had a question about the department that contains the tax ID status.
Oh, it's field, or it's actually, it's the field team that would have that information. And in particular, since we're talking youth and college division, Tiffany, Wisdom, and Quincy are the folks who would know your tax ID status. In order to be compliant, you actually file a end of the year financial report that's connected to it. So it's something we can talk about offline, specifically with individual units, but it's being tracked by the field operations division, which when I was working for the association back in the day, it was called branch and field, but it's the same sort of notion, the group that actually works to, file your taxes at the end of the year. And there's a gentleman inside of the organization, Nazar Scott, who specifically, his job is to make sure that units are compliant, and that's a part of making sure that when it comes tax time, we're actually filing the right taxes and having the right numbers in terms of, who's who and what's what. So whoever's answering that question, it sounds like you care a lot about this, so definitely follow up with us directly, and we can sort of determine what it really means for you and your unit and how this actually applies to you. All right, well, I'm going to keep going because I want us to do sort of this all sounds great. It's like we're in school. And to be honest, I have to remind myself around these things when we do the work. But how do you actually build out a direct voter contact program? How do you actually build a canvas? So I'm going to pull up an example and sort of talk it through. That is a real world example. We did this with some folks in Mississippi, a gentleman by the name of Charles Taylor, who I think is pretty dope. Actually, we sat down and said, what would it mean in Mississippi if we were going to play in an election space in terms of doing a canvas? And this is actually about budget and numbers and how do you do the math. And so I'm going to highlight a way in which we think about how we build up these programs and actually make it make sense. So when you're thinking about the notion of knocking on doors, we know that you want to think through, first and foremost, a schedule. And so I just highlighted on the screen what it would look like to have a schedule, if you will, that includes, certain days, certain shifts, how many hours per shift, and how many door hours. And what's meant by that, if you think about it from this standpoint, and we'll pick on Monday. So say on Monday, we decided we were going to do canvassing, but we needed 4 hours, a 4-hour shift from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. In theory, you're not going to be knocking on doors that entire 4 hours. You may be knocking on doors 2 hours or 3 hours. And in this case, we said 2 hours because that first hour allows for folks to arrive, get food, get training on the script, get their minivan set up in terms of technology, get their questions answered. and then drive to their turf, drive to the places where they're going to knock on doors. That could take an entire hour. And then they'll spend about 2 hours knocking on doors. And then they come back in that last hour, turn in all their materials, put in the data in the van, answer any questions, do a debrief, and then go home. But for those 2 hours, we assume that you could probably knock on a door per average, like 20 doors an hour. So if you did a 2-hour shift of just knocking on doors, you got to hit at least 40 doors. That's 20 doors an hour in order for it to, be worth our while. And when we think about it from a value standpoint, each hour is worth 15. And I know some folks are like, why 15? You know about the fight for 15. Our friends in labor and in communities that are really trying to have a better life have looked at the notion that if you're not making $15 an hour or more, it's not a livable wage. And actually the livable wage should be $18 an hour, but we far from even getting 15 in some places, so we're fighting hard. But in this context, we value the work at $15 an hour at a minimum. And so when you think about this formula, what we did in Mississippi is we said, so if we needed to go after 300,000 doors, then we probably got to knock on them 3 times. So if you're knocking on 300,000 doors 3 times, then you end up with 900,000 door knocks. And if you're doing 20 of door knocks an hour, that means you're going to have to have folks do 45,000 hours of knocking on doors in order to get to 300,000 households. And this is important because when you start to think about how to build the work, when somebody says, oh, in the van it says we got to go after 2,000 people. Well, you take the 2,000, multiply it times 3, divided by 20, and that roughly tells you how many hours it's going to take, volunteer or paid hours, in order to get to that universe. The other thing that's important about this document, and we'll make sure it gets sent around, is that there's a contact rate, about 20%. So if you knock on 100 doors, a good contact rate is 15 to 25%. 25% is amazing, but 20% is very solid, meaning 20 people are going to answer their door and talk to you. The other 80 are going to ignore you. And so when you think about it from that standpoint, you're getting about 7 people that you're talking to per hour. So you knock on 20 doors in an hour, you'll talk to 7 people in that hour. And so when you think about the notion of contact rate, there literally is, this notion of how many shifts do you need in order to hit, your contact rate. And in this case, we said we wanted a contact rate of 20% of 180,000. And so when we looked at it, we realized that we needed 45,000 hours on the door, and we needed 63,000 total shift hours. And the 63 number is, remember, the hour in the beginning and the hour at the end. So you really are talking about 63 hours of people's time in order to get to 300,000 doors and talk to 180,000 people. And so when you do this on a schedule, you start to see how you can actually turn this into an operation that is measured and is time-bound and is connected to something real. And so what it also means is that how many canvassers do you need? In this case, we said we would need 281 canvassers to do 45,000 total hours on the door. And it would cost us, just for the canvassers at $15 an hour, about $1,215,000. And this all works together. These numbers all work together in terms of how you would manage a direct voter contact operation. What also is on this chart that's important, sorry, I'm scrolling up and scrolling down, is that you probably need staff or leaders. Because most of our work is volunteer-based, these folks may or may not get paid, and usually we don't. But if we were paying folks, we were looking at, like, if you, in a state like Mississippi, if you needed a state director, you got to pay them something monthly because it's a job. If you need a field director, a data director, an operations manager, who's going to make sure the office's bills are paid and that printing is happening and that food is ordered, having an office manager who's making sure that, the office runs smoothly, human resources director, somebody that's making sure that folks are getting paid, and then legal support, because remember, we're a 501c3 or a C4 operation, so the lawyers have to file paperwork and do reports and make sure that we're compliant. And so when we did this and looking at all of the different staff, we realized that, that actually became a sizable budget as well in terms of having field staff. But then you also think about other parts of the program. Remember when we talked about the notion of direct voter contact programs? So in this case, there's overhead, like paying for office space and office rental and equipment. There's technology. We're using minivan. And so how do you have the technology so that folks are walking on the doors with, you know, a smartphone, if you will, or an apparatus, like an iPad mini even. There's also digital ads and doing digital promotion. In order to do all the text messaging, the SMS, it costs money. And so, you know, you have to put a budget together that talks about, like, how do you reach folks? Even when it comes to Black radio ads cost money. And you all may not know this, but Black women listen to radio more than any other demographic group. And so radio is really effective, and having radio ads matters. And then there's direct mail. Remember I said that some folks still look at mail. You know, it can cost 30 cents per mail to get mail around an election. And so if you did 2 flights of them, you know, that actually ends up being 60 cents per person. And so if you multiply that times 300,000, you get the budget that we got here. And so when you think about the business, if you will, of doing direct voter contact, in this case, this is a canvas operation. If we're going after 300,000 people in the right way, it's going to cost us over $2.5 million. And it's why there's billions of dollars being spent on elections, because this is literally what some folks do as their entire career for campaigns. They literally set up these types of budgets and operations, and they get paid to do it, and they do it in a way that helps the candidate win and hopefully makes the other candidate lose. And then the last thing I'll say, you can use this same type of approach in terms of knocks per hour for voter registration, except that instead of it being a $15 an hour cost, we project that voter registration, it's a little harder to do, and it's a little more expensive in terms of the time. And so it's about $20 an hour. And that's actually more like $20 a voter registration card, if you will, in order to make that work. And so overall, this is a snapshot of how we're going to be approaching program in 2018. And I didn't jump into our targeting and the data and the analytics, the stuff that actually gets us going in terms of who are we going after and why. And we'll save that for future webinars and trainings. But we wanted you all to get a context of, like, here's what we're talking about when we say civic engagement, nonpartisan work. We're talking about tax status, and we're talking about, you know, canvassing and going after new voters through voter registration, or to turn out existing voters who don't vote often and frequent voters through a canvass operation like what I just unpacked here. I know it's a lot of information, and we want folks to ask questions and to start to play around and start to sort of really get this baked into your bones. And if you've done this before, then you can teach this without me. And so we also want to make sure that folks are starting to share information, because when it comes time to mobilize our campuses or our communities, we want you to be at the driver's seat to say, hey, Jamal, it looks like we got about 3,000 infrequent voters on my campus, and half of them are Black. I'm going to go after all of them with the volunteer program, and it's going to take us X amount of hours, and here's our budget in terms of materials and food, and let's really go after this universe so that we win. That's the place that we want to be at when we get, you know, closer to the election in terms of September, October, and of course November. But, you know, we're starting with this and it's why Winston was saying it's sort of a 101, because this sort of sets the foundation for as we start to get more in depth around who we're going after and why, and then thinking about the message and the messengers and really bringing this all to life. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions. And I'm not sure if President Johnson was able to join as of yet, but if he is, it'd be a great time for him to actually share some words of wisdom and leadership as it relates to where we are.
We had a question from Mirandon about, will the association give money to all state conferences for GOTV this year?
Sorry, you're a little muffled. Can you repeat the question again?
Is that will the association give money to all state conferences for GOTV this year?
So I want to be very transparent, and since I've been a part of the association, there's never been a time where every single state in the state area conference gets money from national to do GOTV. And when I say that, that's, you know, sort of speaking from a historical perspective. There is times where, and we will do that this year, where there is money that's coming in for specific states. And so there are donors and funders out there who are looking at the data, which we didn't talk about on this call, who will say, we're spending $5 million on elections in Nevada. And because Black folks are in Nevada, they look at a percentage and says that means that there's, you know, a couple $100,000 on the table for Nevada. NAACP, what can you do? And so that's how we're actually looking at the processes. We are here to raise money based upon what the donor and funding community is willing to invest in. Now, I say that because there's a caveat. Every single state, for the most part, has people in it and organizations in it who give money to civic engagement. And so where we can't organize national pots of money, we can work with certain state conferences and state area conference and even branches to figure out who is giving money locally. For example, when I lived in Los Angeles and was a part of the Beverly Hills Hollywood branch, there are unions in LA who only give money for civic engagement work in LA. And the branches had to, you know, actually form those relationships, show what they're targeting and what it looks like, and then say, here's what we need in order to hit our goals. And they would get money that way. And so we're willing to actually provide the support and the data for you everywhere to generate your own money. And the last thing I would say is that even when I was in the college chapter in undergrad, our school had a pot of money for what they called civic participation. And so the college chapter had to write a proposal to the university and get it approved by the school senate to get money. And that wasn't necessarily national, you know, providing the money directly, but that was national really helping to advise and make sure that the plan was tight so that we could get our funding. And so we're in a position to do that as well. So it'll be a mixture of us bringing resources where we can and really driving that space, but also helping the units really perfect their approach so that they can attract their own state, local, and even regional resources that we nationally would never be able to raise. I hope that answered your question.
Are there any other questions that we have for Jamal?
Well, I'm going to put something out there that's not a part of this webinar that we're going to be lifting up more as we move forward is our partnership work. And for the Youth and College Division, there are some partners who really matter to us in a different way because they are youth focused or they exist in a community and a campus context. For example, the partnership that we have with the National Pan-Hellenic Council, the Divine Nine or Black Greek letter organizations is real, and that's going to materialize in terms of campus work, you know, around the country that we want our units to be able to lean in on and lead on and to really leverage. There's also work that's happening with the young people who are doing the March for Our Lives tour. That's a partnership, and that's about young people really addressing the issue of gun violence and gun regulation, and that matters. And so as we continue to develop relationships, and I know Tiffany, Wisdom, and Quincy are going to have a laundry list of folks who really want to work with the Youth and College Division, you know, the BYP 100s of the world, if you will, the Dream Defenders. We want to make sure that we're also, you know, really making sure that we as NAACP show up strong in a civic engagement context. And some of that's about resources and money, and some of that's about just being able to say, we know what we're doing in terms of running a 501c4 program. We're going after this many new voters, and this is how many hours it's going to take us. So will you join us to hit these goals? And so we really want to dig deep and get into that space in the coming weeks so that you all are empowered to really run your own programs and really be able to generate your own resources. And where we can, we'll be able to provide resources. And the last thing I'll say about resources, which I completely, you know, would be remiss if I didn't, we have decided that this year we're going to test out campus coordinators and maybe even doing a stipend, some type of funding for those campus coordinators. And I say that because when I lived in the great state of California, where I'm from, the state conference, Alice Huffman in particular, Willis Edwards, Willie Brown was on the board. They created a budget to give a stipend on campuses. And I was a campus coordinator for several campaigns that were run by the state conference in NAACP, and I got some book money. You know, $500 here and there really went a long way, but it also allowed for me to give the amount of hours I needed to organize the canvas and voter registration. So we're going to try to test that out this year in several states, you know, and it's why Next Gen, for example, an organization headed up by Tom Steyer, the guy who talks about impeaching Trump in his commercials, is in partnership with us because we really want to go deep and invest in a different way with the Youth and College Division so that you all are able to do work at scale in your targeted communities or campuses, if you will. So that's something that also is being developed as a strategy, thanks to Wisdom, Tiffany, and Quincy for their insight and leadership on that front.
We got a question from Quincy, actually. Unmuted you.
Hey, Jamal, this is a question I got from one of the Youth Work Committee members. Will youth units be able to directly apply to the national office for funds for states that are not a part of the targeted areas?
I think what we will end up doing is having that conversation state by state. So, for example, actually, it would be a bad example because I don't think we have any youth units in North Dakota, South Dakota, or Montana, but there's very little resources, for example, for Black folks' work in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana. It's not to say that we're not there and don't have people there. It's just there's not going to be a ton of resources because of the population. And if you look at a state like Utah, even, who we have an amazing team of volunteers and leaders out there, Janetta Williams and others, there's about 30,000 Black folks in the state that has over 1 million people. So the investment is a lot smaller. So it really depends on the state. But when you think about, other states, the Memphises of the world, well, it's not a state, but Tennessee's of the world, if you will, or New York even, or California, Illinois, those states may not be the places where we really have to slug it out to win, where it's a different type of, election season. But there are places where there's enough Black folks, enough NAACP people and infrastructure that can attract resources. And I said this earlier, it may not be resources coming from the national, because we're raising money based upon where funders actually want to fund and have to fund because they feel like it's strategic. But it could be that we help the units figure out how to raise money in a state or local or regional context. So I think you should, be thinking about it through that lens as well. Is what does resources look like in your community? And if you've never done this before, I may be speaking a different language to you, and we will start to unpack that. And I think, Quincy, I'm glad you raised this question. We may need to do a fundraising webinar because, again, when I was in a college chapter, I was a political action chair of my college chapter. Just raised $30,000 every year for 2 years. It's only 2 years, so $60,000. It was literally just for my college chapter. It was around civic participation work. So I think it's how do we actually empower folks to figure out how to go after resources in their own local communities or through their campuses in a way that's going to get them there. And I know, Tiffany, you eat this up in a great way and know how to do this brilliantly. And so we just want to make sure that, we're also thinking through that lens of teaching folks how to do this at scale so that, with the national office, you actually are able to attract your own resources.
We got about 3 minutes left, and so if there's any folks who had any more questions while we have Jamal on.
Well, hearing none, I will say this. I want to make sure you all have my email address. I have started back at the association. Today is my 90th day. So I've been here for 3 months now as of today. But my inbox is always open. And I've had some folks say, I tried to email you and I haven't heard from you. And they were sending the email to the wrong address. So the email address is a little tricky, but it's jawatkins@naacpnet.org. And I know that Wisdom will share out that information. But if you have any questions and I say any questions, there's no silly question or a question that doesn't make sense. Ask them because we want to make sure that folks have their questions answered. But as we continue to do trainings and work with you all, we want to make sure that we're building out the powerful army that the Youth and College Division is, but in a way that speaks to how do we really own and run civic engagement in our community. So, I'm sort of imparting this message. I know that President Johnson had to hop off because literally we're right now in a Supreme Court fight. Mr. Trump, I'm not going to call him president, has announced that he wants Brett Kavanaugh from the state of Maryland to be the next Supreme Court justice of the land. And we're arguing that they need to wait until after this election cycle and after the new Congress is elected and the new Senate is elected so that the American people can have their voices heard, similar to exactly what the Republicans said during President Obama's last year. Wait until the election is over to let the American people have their pick of the Supreme Court justice. So we're dealing with that now, and I know President Johnson is going to be leading this charge along with folks from the Urban League and Leadership Conference and other partner organizations. I know the Links, for example, have leaned in, and the National Panhellenic has leaned in. And so you're going to see the civic engagement work really heat up as it relates to the fights that we have, but also the core stuff that you see on the screen right now around canvassing, registering new voters, and really, achieving what we need in order to build back Black independent political power, because losing has its consequences and we are tired of losing. And, it shouldn't be on our watch. So I'm looking forward to working with you all. I thank Tiffany and team. Brendan, thanks for being on a call with me earlier. Erica, others, I'm just excited about the work that we're going to do. It's going to be dope. It's going to be exciting. We want to learn and grow, but we're going to fight it out city by city, state by state, campus by campus to make sure that we're really reclaiming what should be ours and doing what's best for the communities we serve.
Thank you, Jamal, so much. And I just want to echo the sentiments that Jamal brought up, just making sure that that as youth and college leaders, we are fully engaged as the next generation of civil rights leaders. And that, as we talked about earlier with some of the leaders of the National Youth Works Committee, that we're going to be starting to focusing on making sure that people do get these van trainings, that we do have deliverables, actual tangible steps to move forward in our civic engagement plan. And so I just want to say thank you to everybody for being on the call and for being committed to being here and to being present. As we have further calls in the future, we'll definitely make sure there is ample time for people to prepare, for people to have time, for people to have notice. I appreciate everyone who's able to jump on time, as well as people who came on later on. And that is about it. If you have any questions, I'll definitely forward Jamal's email as well as mine. And we look forward to seeing everybody at convention. Thank you very much.
Good night, folks.